We're going to kick off today's show by taking a deep dive into the world of Vice President Mike Pence. The great investigative journalist Jane Mayer has a fascinating expose on Pence in the recent issue of the New Yorker magazine. The title of it is The Danger of President Mike Pence. Jane is one of the best journalists of our time, and she was one of the first reporters to crack open the CIA torture and extraordinary rendition program under Bush and Cheney. She has written a number of books. Her latest work has focused on investigating the Koch brothers and other shady right-wing or Republican financiers. Her most recent book is called Dark Money: The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right. Jane Mayer joins me now. Jane, welcome to Intercepted.
Thank you so much for having me.
What I really found extraordinary about your piece is this notion of Mike Pence not really as a principled conservative Christian, but as a real opportunist willing to set aside what he claimed were his bedrock principles in favor of whatever his kind of corporate paymasters or political expediency dictates he should do. Is that your sense?
Yeah, and that was a surprise to me, too. I mean, I think everybody had thought of him as kind of defining social conservatism and evangelical Christianity. And in fact, what the reporting showed was that he's very ambitious. And he's made his deals when he needs to. And in fact, his whole career really has been nurtured, supported, and sponsored by huge right-wing corporate interests. And I hadn't realized that myself until I dug into it.
There was a sense that Mike Pence was kind of this like shitty magic penny to buy the Christian rights, sort of like calm with the idea of Trump being president.
He definitely was. He was the bridge. He was the seal of good housekeeping that enabled the Christian right to come on board. And, you know, going to your first question about the surprise of how ambitious he was and how willing he was to cut deals when he needed to, I mean, it shouldn't have been a surprise because the biggest deal and the biggest sort of Faustian bargain that he's made was getting on the ticket with Donald Trump, who, of course, defines everything that Christian evangelicals say that they dislike, you know. His willingness to make that deal should have tipped everybody off.
You were able to get some pretty powerful quotes or assertions from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. He, of course, is the Democratic senator from Rhode Island. And one of the things that he said to you was that if Mike Pence were to become president, that the government would be run by the Koch brothers. Maybe you can unpack that and explain the connection between, because the Koch brothers aren't known as fanatical Christian supremacists.
No, and I mean, and so isn't that interesting? The Kochs are libertarians, or you could call them neoliberals. They are supposedly people who believe in kind of social liberalism, but there they are having sponsored the career of Mike Pence. And I think it's a real tip-off to what the Kochs really care about. The issue that matters to them is not any of the social issues, no matter what they're saying. What matters to them is allowing business to take over the power in the country, and particularly their own business. So they're pushing back on regulations and they're pushing back on taxes and trying to shrink the power of the government and replace it with their own power. And Mike Pence has been willing to carry their water on that. I hadn't realized, despite writing Dark Money, a book about the Kochs, I hadn't realized the extent to which they were working hand in glove with Pence and vice versa, and how it began. And it really goes back to 2009 in earnest. I mean, it starts before then in his working for think tanks that are funded by corporations and huge right-wing donors such as the Kochs. But in 2009, there was a piece of legislation moving forward in Congress that was a huge threat to Koch Industries, and that was a tax on carbon pollution, something that would make the fossil fuel companies like Koch Industries pay for what they were doing to the environment. And Pence really took up their cause in 2009, and he echoed their talking points. He took a petition that was created by the Koch's main political group, Americans for Prosperity, and he got tons of signatures on it in Congress and eventually managed to help kill that bill in the Senate so it never happened, and also to kind of permanently align the Republican Party against doing anything to try to deal with climate change. That was a gift of major proportions to Koch Industries. That cemented his relationship with the Kochs, and they then started just pouring money into him. They sponsored the next phases of his career, and they really began to push for the idea of Pence himself becoming a presidential candidate, and they were hoping it would come out that way. But Pence kind of screwed it up. He goes back to Indiana, becomes governor, and he's really a failure. And he makes decisions and takes positions that hurt him so much that he can't run for president right away.
You point out that Mike Pence was in Congress for 12 years and never once authored a successful bill. That's kind of astonishing when you realize, like, this guy was basically a failure in getting any legislation passed. However, he used every platform he had not to be good at that job, but to be kind of a shock troop for whoever his funders were or wherever the support was coming from that he thought would most put him in the prime position to gain national recognition or national power.
He actually rose to a pretty high position in the leadership, the number 3 position of the Republican House, and he used that position also to push the Republican Party far, far to the right. So you find him very early on supporting the rise of the Tea Party and speaking out at Tea Party rallies and talking about defunding the whole government. He wanted to defund Planned Parenthood or he was going to shut down the government, he said.
We repealed Obamacare, lock, stock, and barrel on the floor of the House of Representatives, and we voted to cut spending to pre-stimulus, pre-bailout levels, defunding Obamacare, and ending all public funding for Planned Parenthood of America. That's what we voted.
So he's taking these radical positions that we, at the time, were considered shocking. But he's part of this whole effort to push the Republican Party in line with its far-right economic interests and push it further and further to the right.
I read your piece, and I get the sense that he's kind of this far right-wing, almost Manchurian candidate, where it's like they've programmed someone, that can pass as kind of a Christian for the needs of convincing people that he's with them. But really, he seems to do whatever the Koch brothers tell him to right now, or whoever else is paying the bills.
Well, there is an economic, fiscal side of the conservatism he espouses, and people hadn't paid that much attention to it. And it's just as radical as his views are on social issues. You know, many of the people that work for him are people who come directly out of the Koch world, so which to me was very interesting, in part because I really believe that the reason that Trump was elected was because he broke with the orthodoxy of the far-right donors. They had moved so far away from the base that I think there was an opening for Trump to run on, to be more of a populist and to say things like, you need Social Security, you need Medicare. These things were ideas that really appealed to the base of the Republican Party and to many Americans who weren't even that political. And he also talked about the corruption of the government and how he was going to stick it to the big donors and specifically stick it to the Kochs. But he hasn't done that. So I was interested in why. And in particular, I think part of the reason is that he's naive about government. He has no experience in government. He's bored by the details. And who's at his side who really does understand it? It's Mike Pence. And so Mike Pence runs the transition and fills the Trump administration with people who are really Koch people. And so even though Trump has run a campaign that's populist, he's running a government that is Kochian in its nature and more so. I mean, we see it with the so-called tax reform plan, because you've really kind of got an infiltration going on in the Trump administration by the big old donor interests that have been trying to grab control for decades now.
Talk about how Mike Pompeo ends up as CIA director and his connections to Pence and the Koch brothers.
The reporting on this comes partly from a number of people I interviewed who were inside the transition team. And one of them in particular was saying to me, Mike Pompeo was not even on the radar for Trump. He wouldn't have known him from anybody else. until like a couple days before he actually appointed him to be running the CIA. He came in, he had a nice interview with Trump, and like a day or two later was named to run the CIA. He didn't know, Trump wouldn't have known where he came from. But where did he come from? He was the congressman from Wichita, Kansas. He was the Koch's congressman. He's someone whose business the Kochs had helped support. Within the administration, he and Mike Pence are very close. And Pence has hosted an evangelical Bible study group that's for cabinet members, and Pompeo often comes to it. And it's led by a preacher named Ralph Drollinger, who has been incredibly controversial. In California, he wrote some essays that suggested that women who served in the state legislature were sinners if they had children because they were leaving their children at home to do public service, and that was literally a sin. Yeah, I mean, talk about someone who's got sort of anti-female, old-fashioned and almost dark age ideas of women. That would be Ralph Drollinger. And there he is, because Pence has sponsored him, running a Bible study group. Though it's interesting, there is a female member of it, too, someone who you've written about, Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education now, and she attends these sessions. But presumably her children are not little and at home.
You talked to Steve Bannon for this piece, which I thought was quite interesting that Bannon agreed to talk to you, although in some ways maybe not surprising because Bannon now is threatening to try to run Senate candidates against everybody except Ted Cruz. He's his own particular kind of force. But Bannon was the big one who was saying, the globalists inside the administration are the ones that Trump has to worry about, and the globalists in the deep state. What were the insights you gained from Steve Bannon about everything that's happened in the 9 or 10 months of Trump?
Well, I mean, specifically what Bannon said to me, I thought was just amazing, which was he feared that Pence would be a president who would be owned by the Kochs. The thing is that Bannon has long been a critic of the Koch brothers because Bannon sees himself as a new kind of nationalist populist, and he sees the Kochs as hurting middle-class people. And so he's in a different place. It's not to say that he doesn't have his own corporate sponsors. In fact, his biggest backer is Robert Mercer, the hedge fund magnate. But Mercer is more of a nationalist and a populist, I guess, to some extent. It's hard to know. But at any rate, Bannon comes out as a critic of the sort of big corporate donors who he sees as pulling the party away from his people, the kind of working class and middle class white guys of the country.
One of the people that I've written a lot about, Eric Prince, is one of the names, the founder of the Blackwater Mercenary Company, one of the names that has been floated as a potential candidate on Bannon's slate, if you will, possibly in Michigan, but it looks more likely in Wyoming. And Eric Prince would regularly call in to Steve Bannon's radio show on Breitbart and pontificate on all sorts of issues.
Turn to Eric Prince. Give us, Eric, you're a professional in this area. If you want to take the fight to ISIS, if we want to destroy ISIS, if they're the existential threat that they say they are to us, what do we do?
Well, here's what the Trump administration needs to do, because I can't imagine the Clinton administration contemplating actually ending the ISIS scourge. And it's not just a matter of cutting off the head of the snake. It's about chewing up and destroying the entire snake.
It sort of was like akin to like bin Laden's guys are dropping a tape off with Al Jazeera. Like Eric Prince would like call into Steve Bannon's show. And I would imagine that Eric Prince fully has bought into Bannon's kind of worldview, particularly when it comes to kind of right-wing, libertarian, populist, nationalist tendencies. What's your sense overall of what Bannon is doing right now, given that he's become such a prominent figure and clearly has his own following?
One of the things that Bannon has been fighting is what he calls the Empire Project. And when he was in the White House, he was pushing back against the idea of sort of endless war in endless number of countries, which he sees as taking the lives of too many of the kinds of people who he's championing. And he was trying to privatize some of these conflicts and reduce the defense spending, supposedly. I mean, this was the idea. And so he was pushing the idea that his friend Eric Prince would use his private mercenary company to take over at least security in some of these projects. And the military was dead set against it and created huge fights. But that's one place where the two of them are allied.
Eric Prince also was a financier of Mike Pence's political career. And in fact, in 2004, in the aftermath of the Blackwater operatives being killed in Fallujah and strung up from the bridge, Mike Pence organized the welcome reception for Eric Prince onto Capitol Hill. And that's really when Eric Prince's mercenary business took off. And it was Mike Pence that welcomed him there, which is interesting given that Pence and Bannon seem to have been on the opposite ends of the spectrum ideologically within the Trump administration. I would have thought that Pence would have also sort of on this issue joined forces with Bannon to say, hey, General Mattis, you should consider our buddy Eric Prince here and what he's proposing. So that to me is fascinating.
I think you're onto something there, because I don't think that Pence was dead set against Prince's idea. Pence attends the principals committee meetings, which are where, the most important foreign policy arguments take place within the White House. And my sense was, and I think Bannon said to me at some point, that Pence was no fan of what he called the Empire Project, meaning this sort of endless expansion of these wars, and that Pence was asking some tough questions about it. That's not to say that Pence was backing Prince particularly either. I mean, the thing about getting back to the very beginning of the questions you raised, the thing about Pence is he's kind of weaselly about many positions. He's not someone who you see an incredibly strong backbone who gets out front and tells, for instance, President Trump when he's wrong. He's very careful and very behind the scenes. But anyway, so they may have had more common ground on that than people realize.
Who brought Pence and Trump together, and how did Pence end up on that ticket?
Well, to some extent, it was the Trump kids who really created that shotgun marriage. And according to the people that I was interviewing, Jared Kushner in particular had a longstanding family grievance against Chris Christie, who had prosecuted his father when Chris Christie was the U.S. attorney in New Jersey. And so there was kind of a personal beef there. But yet Trump, it seems, really liked Christie and was kind of leaning that way. I actually interviewed Trump during that period, and he sounded very torn. And it turns out that even after Trump had had a sort of what was supposed to have been the big coming together with Pence, they'd had dinner, and then they'd had a family breakfast together, and the Trump family kids came in, and everybody was sort of on the same playbook, and word came out that Pence was going to take the job, as he said, in a heartbeat. That very night, apparently, Trump called Chris Christie and continued sort of the romance and was saying, are you ready? And Christie said, ready for what? And Trump said, to do this thing with me. And Christie said, are you asking? And Trump sort of said, well, are you ready? And, it was this kind of endless flirtation. And stay by your phone, Trump said to Christie. It was like he couldn't quite get himself to be comfortable with Pence. And even after they named Pence publicly, Trump was still asking his advisors, can I get out of this? Can I back out of it? Now, I got to be fair, though, to say since then, Trump has been fully on board with Pence and considers it one of his best decisions, apparently, according to many people who I interviewed. And the description he's given about why he thinks Pence is so great. When Pence was speaking at the Republican National Convention, and I talked to Newt Gingrich, who was behind the scenes talking to Trump when Pence was speaking, and Trump turned to him and said, isn't he perfect? He looks like he was sent by central casting. So Trump loves the way Pence looks like a vice president.
Well, that sounds like the thing you're really looking for, someone that just looks like a vice president. However, it underscores something that another historian you interviewed said, that Pence is basically the sycophant in chief. He really is used by Trump on a regular basis. I don't think I've ever seen a vice president carted out as though he's at a pep rally to introduce the president anywhere near the numbers that Trump has carted Pence out. It's almost like he puts him in this position that's intended to say, here's my carnival barker, or here's my hype man that's going to come out for a couple minutes, and then the real king shows up.
One of the people I talked to, I tried to speak to some former vice presidents, and one in particular, Walter Mondale, found it so demeaning because Mondale had actually tried to negotiate a contract when he became vice president with Jimmy Carter to make the role into a more substantial role and something that's more dignified. But he's watching Pence, and he said to me, what's he doing? I ask myself every day. And he looks at Pence as sort of acting like an MC for the president, and it's not stupid, it's shrewd. He is the member of the White House team that has not gotten in trouble, as far as we know, with the president. He knows that the president likes to be flattered. And, you can see probably biding his time. And that's why I ended the piece with the quote from the Bible that Pence keeps over his mantle in the vice presidential residence, which it talks about how God has his future in mind.
Mike Pence seems to have also been put in a position, particularly with the General Flynn situation, where either he was being lied to and then was sent to the wolves, basically, to repeat the lie in public, or he did know and took a bullet, essentially, for the president's reputation or the reputation of the administration. Is that your sense?
I mean, it's hard to know for sure. There's one meeting that would clarify the answer to that, and we don't know exactly what happened there. But Pence was in a meeting at the White House when Trump announced that he wanted to get rid of James Comey as the head of the FBI. And he was angry about Comey doing an investigation into him and the Russian ties. And they cooked up the idea that they would get the Justice Department to go out front and recommend that he get rid of Comey. And that would give him some cover to do it. And it wouldn't just look like obstruction of justice. And Pence was in that meeting. But until we really know what he said, what he heard, what the conversation was like, it's very hard to know for sure whether he was, party to obstruction or whether somehow he absented himself at the right moments. It's just really hard to know. But at any rate, he came out and said,
let me be very clear that the president's decision to accept the recommendation of the Deputy Attorney General and the Attorney General to remove Director Comey as the head of the FBI was based solely and exclusively on his commitment to the best interest of the American people.
There were a few little weasel words there that give him some outs, but he basically spread the party line that gave the president cover. And then, of course, the president came out a few hours later and said,
he's a showboat, he's a grandstander. I was going to fire Comey. My decision. There's no good time to do it, by the way.
Which left Pence out there looking like a, complete chump or a liar. And I think you have to know more before you can really say for sure. And I think we may know more at some point because I think Mueller's going to go into that meeting very carefully. And hopefully it will be more transparent, and then we'll see.
There's a level of arrogance about the Russia investigation, specifically on Trump's part, that he himself has this arrogance about it, where either he knows that there's nothing there that's going to stick, or he just seems to believe that he'll be able to weather it with his Twitter account and by lying. I mean, what's your sense of what's going to happen there? I mean, are they going to get something to stick to Trump himself?
Who knows? I mean, I'm not in the prediction business, but I did interview Tony Schwartz, who wrote The Art of the Deal for Trump. And one of the things he talks about is how, for Trump, truth is so malleable. He doesn't care really what's true, what's not true, what should be true. It's all kind of the same for him.
Well, that's not how the courts work, though.
No, it's not. It seems like at the moment, Mueller is pushing very hard against Paul Manafort and probably against General Mike Flynn. That seems to be where he's most likely to find sort of legal violations. But there is the possibility of an obstruction case here. Obstruction by Trump and potentially obstruction by Pence. Neither of them are off the hook. I mean, one thing I can say about being a Washington reporter for The New Yorker is there's not a single uninteresting day these days.
Jane Mayer, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on Intercepted.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much, Jeremy.
Jane Mayer is an investigative journalist at The New Yorker magazine. Her latest piece is called The Danger of President Mike Pence, and her most recent book is Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right.